Okay, great. And we will begin. So today, the whole idea of using self-disclosure, I know has both some advantages and disadvantages. So these were the objectives that I thought we could easily cover in the time frame that we've got here, to both talk about the value of using self-disclosure as a tool to increase participant engagement, to learn some appropriate applications of self-disclosure as a facilitation tool. An important one that I don't want to forget about is understanding when self-disclosure is not appropriate in group facilitation. And then also understanding the pitfalls of using self-disclosure indiscriminately. So with that, we're going to dive right in. And I like to start by talking about some of the challenges. I used to teach social work at Pitt State University, and that's Pittsburgh State, Kansas, not Pennsylvania. But when I was the practicum director, and I did that for about a decade, I had lots of students come in my classroom being involved in the practicum aspect. I was at the kind of the end of their program. And many of them had already been taught by some of my colleagues about self-disclosure. And some of the things that they were taught, I wanted to kind of think about those, but also ask you, when you were getting your education or when you were beginning your experience in this work, what were you taught about the use of self-disclosure? And you can just put it in the chat. If somebody wants to shout it out, I don't know if you have the capacity to do that. Paul hasn't drank coffee. Okay, Paul. Yeah, it was a no-no, nothing, not appropriate. Very rarely appropriate. Don't do it. Yeah. And that's what my students have been told too. Don't do it. It isn't appropriate. And they were even given some specific reasons why it isn't appropriate. What were some of the reasons why? What are some of those common beliefs against using self-disclosure? Knowing when, yeah. In my first BIP training, no. It was dangerous. Yeah. And when we think about it being dangerous, here are some of the things that my students were telling me that they were told by their practicum placement site, or they were told by other professors. If I use self-disclosure, they're going to use it against me. It'll ruin my reputation. It'll ruin my credibility. It undercuts the facilitator's authority. Has anybody heard that? Need to have a blank slate to better identify projection and transference. They will find out who I am. Yeah, wait, that's good. They'll turn the session around about you instead of them. Yeah, in one way or another, letting us know they won't respect me if I use self-disclosure. That it was unprofessional. So they're going to use it against me. It's unprofessional. And that's been really, in many ways, kind of pounded in our brains in this work. And I can tell you that all of those things can happen if we use self-disclosure indiscriminately. And there are some real pitfalls of self-disclosure. I see them as really falling into 3 different categories. One is if we make it about us, if we make it about the facilitator, where when we end up saying something, it is about us trying to impress them with who we are, with us. It is using the group actually for the facilitator's benefit. And it is stealing the spotlight from the group. So instead of doing the work that we're supposed to be doing, we're suddenly instead getting the group all concerned about or admiring of the facilitator. And that's not the purpose of the group. Another way that it can be used in a disadvantageous way is when we provide too much information. Too much information just provided for shock and awe, or too much information can provide unnecessary risk for us. And I don't know what all the different agencies are that you work in, but the type of agency that you are working in, you have to keep that in mind when it comes to what is the unnecessary risk. For example, if you are working inside of a prison, how much information you want to provide, it's really important to not take unnecessary risk. The other way too much information is a challenge is if your disclosure becomes a distraction from their learning and from the intention of the group. Then there's a third way, and that's what I call collateral damage, where actually we are doing the very thing that we are trying to tell the group members to not do. Because in this work, what we want is for them to be able to hold their partner and their loved ones in high regard, and in everything they do, having consideration of the impact it would have on their partner, right? Isn't that part of what we're training them on? If we turn around and we give a self-disclosure where we are throwing our partner under the bus, then ultimately we have lost credibility with our group, as well as colluding with them when they throw their partner under the bus. So it is so critical that we keep our loved ones' interests in mind. My husband and I have been doing this work for, forever, probably together about 30 years. And one of the things, he's in a lot of different groups. I know he does a whole lot of self-disclosure. But one of the things that I have confidence in is that if his group members cross my path in one way or another, that he will not have thrown me under the bus. If he's doing some kind of self-disclosure, it's going to be maybe about something that is in our relationship, but it will be much more about the lessons he learned. In fact, sometimes I'm a little bit uncomfortable because I feel like he probably doesn't give enough of a realistic view of me sometimes. But overall, I think that's one thing that we can really think about in the pitfalls of self-disclosure is in some way having our partner in a negative light. The other thing, however, is with all of those problems, why would we ever want to use self-disclosure is what you might be thinking. And I say it is worthy of our consideration. Bessel van der Kolk was working with a group of Vietnam veterans. And he said he was getting nowhere, and he was getting nowhere fast. And then he realized he had to become vulnerable. He didn't have to go to Vietnam and have that lived experience, but he did have to have a lived experience that was relatable for them to be vulnerable and for them to really find the magic of the group. He had to be vulnerable too. Now, I don't know how many of you had the good fortune, the good insight, or whatever, to go to the session on practices for self-reflection. And I know I will mistakenly pronounce her name, but Jojo Palmaria is my best bet, my best choice. And Jessica is nodding, so hopefully I haven't destroyed it too badly. But in her presentation, there were so many moments I was saying, yes. One of the things she was talking about was the importance of vulnerability in our work, of being real, of being able to self-reflect. And I think that speaks so much to the three powerful uses of self-disclosure. We find that self-disclosure is a very useful tool for validation. In fact, we don't have to think very far back to think of the Me Too movement. And really, that's what the Me Too movement was. The power of that was validation. It was, you're not in this alone. And with that growing body of other people, it gave credibility and it gave validation. Alice Miller, in her book, For Your Own Good, talks about this very thing. She says to have a therapist who herself has worked on her story and doesn't hesitate to share can be very helpful to the patient because it creates trust, understanding, and a shared experience. I can tell you, I have had many blessings in my life where someone extended and shared their experience at a time when I needed that. The time that comes most to mind was when I was working on my master's in social work, and I had just started the first semester on that. And it was in September, and my 15-year-old son, Jason, died by suicide. And at that moment, I was a mess. But there was this woman, Ellen Foshak, who happened to be my practicum supervisor, on-site supervisor. And you know, on that fateful day, she could have chosen many different responses. I can imagine somebody in that situation hearing what had happened to a mother who was coming in as their practicum student. She could have said, oh, well, my life is tough enough. I think I'm going to need to find a reason to not be Dorothy's practicum instructor. Or she could have said, wow, this is going to be tough, I'm going to have to think about what to say and how to respond when Dorothy comes in for supervision on Thursday. She didn't do either of those. Ellen Foshag landed on my doorstep within hours. And I lived about 30 minutes away. But she was there. And she shared. She had never experienced the loss of a child, but she had experienced some real challenging circumstances. And because she shared those and made herself vulnerable, I can remember to this day some of the things she said. Because people remember when they are going through the trauma or reliving the trauma. She was an enlightened witness to me. And the beauty of this work is that if we have done our work and we're doing the self-reflection that we heard so much about in the last training, we can be there and we can show up for people when they're in our group and when they need a professional enlightened witness to be there for them. Oh, one of the things I didn't share with you is that Ellen Foshag was also blind, but she was there. She made it happen. And I will always be indebted to her. She didn't stop and question, but instead what she did was she really led by example. So the validation often flows right into leading by example. I know that the name Brene Brown came up in an earlier presentation. And Brene does say vulnerability is the only bridge to connection. Now, I don't know if that's true. I haven't tested everything under the sun to see what else is a bridge to connection, but I can tell you that vulnerability is a mighty one that we can use to our advantage if we use it wisely. Dr. Bruce Perry, in his book, What Happened to You, that he and Oprah Winfrey wrote, he talks about connectedness allows people to heal. You know, if we don't connect with people, then we are really stunted in being able to help them in their journey. Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, Judith Herman, Dr. Bruce Perry, those specialists who really understand trauma keep repeating this to us. Connectedness allows people to heal. And so how do we connect? How do we get that to happen? And I think self-disclosure plays a big role in that. One of the things it does is it helps create a safety net. Often in social work classes in the 80s and 90s and now in presentations and trainings, We often make a list of things that people need in order to share something that they have a whole lot of vulnerable feelings about. And one of the things that almost always comes up on that list is somebody else going first. If we're in a group and we're asked to share something, it is really hard to be that first person. Stephen Porges says, safety is the therapy. Creating that safe space is really what allows people to do the work. The nice thing is we don't have to fix anybody, but we do need to figure out how can we artfully create that safe container, whether it's on Zoom or whether it's in person. How do we create that safe space? What are some of the things that when you think of creating a safe space come up for you? Yeah, Paul, C.S. Lewis, that is wonderful. Julia, with your question about will this session be sent out as a recording, I think that that will happen. That's my understanding anyway. Yes, Paul, no one will hold what I say against me. Right. And how do we know that no one is going to hold what I say against me? No judgy, no disdain, no I'm holier than thou. Yeah, community guidelines, modeling self-compassion. And when you think about all of these things that you all are mentioning, how tied are they to us being vulnerable and being able to artfully, in one way or another, share things about ourselves, things that on first blush, we didn't want to go there either. And I can tell you, if we phone it in, they'll phone it in. But if we don't phone it in, if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in ways that do not create unnecessary physical risk, that sort of thing. But if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, yes, Gillian, we can show that change is possible. That isn't always easy. And I have to be honest with you and let you know that that is not where I started. That's not where I started in group work. I think I was pretty good in my work with victims. And I did, I was the director of a domestic violence shelter program in Southeast Kansas for a decade. And it was like 5 years in that process before I started working with those who do harm. And I think that in my work with victims, I pretty naturally came to using pieces of self-disclosure to help them make transformational change, to help them connect and I could do that in a very authentic way. But when I started working with those who cause harm, I had all of these cases in my mind, all of these victims in my mind, and their stories of how their abusers had gotten by with doing horrific acts to them, and nobody held their offender accountable. And so when I started doing what in Kansas we call battering intervention programming. When I started doing that work, my mind was, okay, they're coming to this group room and they're not getting out of here, getting by with pulling the stuff that they've pulled before. They are going to be held accountable. And so the expectation was that they would come into that room, that they would hold themselves accountable, talk about the things that they had probably the most shame about, that was defended in lots of different ways. And I wasn't interested in how they defended it and why they defended it that way. I was interested in them talking about and holding themselves accountable for what they did. As you can imagine, it was almost like a slugfest at first, because they didn't want to talk about that. And I was fueled with all the reasoning why they needed to talk about that. So I had some learning to do. And it took me a while to realize that I, with this group, needed to be vulnerable. It didn't happen overnight. But the more I was able to sort out that my expectations of them were unrealistic, and the more I was able to realize that for them to make transformational change, my being vulnerable with them was helping them much more than my demands. And likewise, it was helping their victims remain safer much more than my demands. So modeling accountability is up here. When we think about modeling accountability, one of the things that I had to learn some things about was power struggles. How about you? Has anybody ended up in group and found yourself in a power struggle with one of your group members? Yeah. Yeah. And I can tell you, I was pretty good with words when it came to those power struggles. You know, I was the person in authority, and I had been a debater. I can debate facts. I know how to do that. I could wear them down. But what was happening while I'm wearing them down? Burning out? Well, I didn't burn out. But what I did do was realize that I was winning the battles, but losing the war, so to speak. First of all, I was envisioning it somewhat as a war, which was not helpful. And I had this burning desire to really be focused on peace. But it was really kind of, yeah, Paul, I was beating them. I was wearing down the connection I had. It became winner versus loser. You all are beautiful. Yes, Lucas, that's what happened to me too. Finding myself part of the system of oppression that they are very accustomed to fighting, right? Yeah. And it is so easy to go there. It is so easy to fall into that trap. Yeah. It is still hard for me to think back at those days of starting about 30 years ago and some of the practices I had. it is amazing that any of them made positive change. And I think maybe they just knew in my heart I meant to do well, but I sure made a lot of mistakes along the way. And one of them was power struggles. One of the things I learned is that the only thing that we can do effectively with power struggles is get out of them. And through self-disclosure, sometimes in group we can talk about that. Wow, John, last week when you were talking about that stuff, it was bringing up a lot for me. And I felt like we were in a power struggle. And I need to do better by you than get into a power struggle with you. I wasn't really hearing what you were saying. I was busy making my point. And that isn't fair to you. Has anybody had that kind of conversation in a group? Paul, I see you nodding your head. Yeah. And how did your group respond?
Well, yeah. It's refreshing to hear somebody own their stuff and apologize without necessarily trying to excuse it. Well, without trying to excuse it. Yeah. It's our job outside the group to understand it and explain it to ourselves. But in the group, it's simply our obligation to be honest and truthful with them when we screw up, as well as when we're acting in a better way.
Yeah. These are great messages coming in the chat, and thank you for saying that, Paul. Yes, it does. It changes their perspective on our relationship. In fact, it gives us power. It gives them power, and it gives us power. It helps create that connection where that work can happen. So one of the things I encourage you to do is be thinking about self-disclosure, not only as how you can really help them understand the curriculum or the point of the day, but modeling through self-disclosure, letting them know when you screw up, getting rid of the we versus they to we're all in this together doing this. Has anybody ever said something that was inappropriate in group? I know I have. Words I wish I could take back. Things that could have been said in a more respectful manner, or in a way that was more compassionate. And I know, and my group knows, that I try to be very victim-centered, and that sometimes I'm going to challenge things because I really want them to hear it from a victim-centered perspective. But I know I can overdo that in a way that shuts them down, because I'm trying to, oh gosh, when I first started, every time they said something that was, not politically correct to the movement, then I was jumping on that. Well, yes, there are things we want to teach them. There are things we hope they can learn. But they are going to learn that much more if I have become vulnerable, if I have let them express their feelings, and I've not restricted that emotional expression. Restricted emotional expression is almost universal in those who are abusive. They've shut down their feelings. If they're talking about their feelings, normally it's a very superficial thing. It's not true emotional expression, not the vulnerable emotions. If we can go there, gosh, it makes it so much easier for them to go there. What about being dismissive, being disrespectful? When I think back, I think some of the times that I was dismissive, I didn't even realize it until the next week or after group. Or, oh gosh, I forgot that this was going on in his life. Anybody else been there? You know, lots of times the other group members know some things that are going on in the other group members' lives. And yeah, Kathleen, I like what you say. I try hard too, but I'm forgetful, and I can tell you I'm much more forgetful now than I was 20 years ago. And yes, co-facilitators are vital. But overall, there have been many, I should have had a V8 moments when I know that I was disrespectful or dismissive of something that matters a whole lot to them. And so to circle back around, to call them, but to then also bring it up in group the next week and say, oh, look, I just want to let the whole group know that I am aware that I was very dismissive of something regarding John last week. And that's not okay. Being late. I love to bring up being late because for the first, oh no, not the first 5, but the next 10 years that I was doing battering intervention, I was teaching full-time at Pitt State. And there was a semester where there was no way that I could work out my schedule there and not have a very tight time between when I left Pitt State in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and I arrived at group in Girard, Kansas. And if everything was going well, I could get there on time. But if it wasn't going well, if I was delayed for some reason, whatever delay, I would get there late. And even though those in the group knew that there was always that chance that Dorothy would be running in at the last minute or late, I wanted to use that opportunity, because how many times do the guys in our groups end up coming late? This is a perfect way that we can model accountability. So one of the things that we put into place was, when we do something we didn't intend to do, but it violates a group rule, that then we have an obligation to the group to make it up. And that doesn't mean doing something huge, but we don't want to tell the guys what they need to do. We want to ask them what they would like to do to make it up to the group. It shouldn't have to cost money. It might be, if they were late one week, the next week coming in 5 minutes early and helping set up the room. It might be, for me, one of the things that I would do is bake cookies And if I didn't get cookies baked, I would buy cookies. But one of the things that the guys knew was that if I ended up being late one week, the next week, and I would point out to them, I was late today, I violated the group rule. Just want to let you know, y'all are going to get cookies next week unless you're saying you want something else. And they normally wanted cookies. So what we wanted to do, and thanks from Kate's about apologizing. And we want to apologize, but one of the things that we know is in their relationship, apologies often happen with the expectation that the victim has to be okay with the apology. So then it's the responsibility is on the victim. We don't want to transfer that into the group room and apologize and them have to be okay with our apology. So instead, we wanted to take it one step further. It's just something I would suggest you try and just make a commitment to do something to get back into integrity with a group. We found it powerful, and we found that the guys would start practicing that in group. And if they were late, they would come up with something, and the group members that had been there for a while would share that with the new group members. And it just started this culture of, if you do something that you didn't intend to, but you still didn't follow the rules, so to speak, then do something to make it up. And we saw them start transferring that to their relationship, which was pretty cool. Not doing what we said we were going to do. That too is another example of how when we get busy, we can sometimes just make an excuse. Oh, I didn't do that, but that was because I got this long phone call or whatever. Can we call ourselves on that? Early on, I was so quick to call those in the group when they were minimizing, denying, or blaming. Because we know, in fact, we talked about it as MDB instead of even saying the words. There's another MDB, there's another MDB. But what gives us the right to do it, And it takes a bit for us to be able to really call ourselves on it. But we know we're getting somewhere when those in the group start being able to notice that amongst themselves, and they've seen us call ourselves on it and do something to get back into integrity, and then they can do that as well. So yeah, I'm certain there are other ways to model accountability. Has anybody got something that they want to throw out there? Those are some of the go-tos that I always try to keep in mind. Well, if you think of something, you can put it in the chat. Another thing is, another reason for self-disclosure is greasing the wheel. And what we're talking about there is when we grease the wheel, we are setting the stage where we know somebody in the group has some kind of big challenge on their mind, and they need to talk about it. And we know they're struggling. They can't get there. They can't talk about it. How can we stage that? How can we share something about us? How can we use self-disclosure to kind of hand it over to them? My husband, Steve, did this. He was there with me when Jason died. And he had a guy in group, probably 25 years later, who was really struggling. This guy had experienced the loss of a child due to suicide. And he wasn't talking about it. And he was struggling in lots of different ways. And finally, Steve decided it was time. And so he shared a little bit about his experience when Jason died. And I should say, the people in the group knew that this had happened. So it was kind of heavy in the room, knew that this young man had lost a child. So it was heavy in the room. But Steve shared, and then he handed it over to this young man and said, "So John, does any of that fit? Was your experience anything like that?" You know what John said? He said, "No, that wasn't my experience. My experience was," and then he opened up and he shared some real powerful stuff. So you don't even have to have the same experience at all, but just the fact that Steve took a deep breath and went there gave this young man the opportunity. So I love this quote. Instead of living our lives in fear of our adverse feelings, we can simply live our lives. And that was kind of the gift that Steve was giving this guy. To be able to walk through some of that, to get seen and heard. So in a nutshell, in using self-disclosure with intention, we want to think about validation. It's the Me Too movement. It's normalizing the experience so that they can open up. And part of that might be validating and using self-disclosure once the conversation has happened, but lots of times it's leading by example. It's using role modeling where we're not playing some other role. You know, the beauty of it is we don't have to. All of us have plenty of experience from our own lives if we dig deep and if we do self-reflection. You know, I will tell you that talking about Jason's death, I did not bring that up in group probably for, I think it was probably at least 15 years, because I was not in a spot where I felt like I could do that and not get totally lost in it. So that's one of the things about using our own stories that we've got to keep in mind. Not only has it been 15 years, because it doesn't always necessarily have to be, but are we in a good enough space today? That doesn't mean that we can't have emotion. I think it is really important that they see that we too have experienced pain, that we too continue to be impacted by things from our life. But we also don't want to bring something in there where we end up having them concerned about us for the next week. And I've also had someone who was sitting in an observing group multiple times who, is working in another program and was wanting to use self-disclosure. And in check-in in group, we always check in with how you feeling, mad, sad, glad, and afraid. And then we have something else we're checking in with. And she checked in with being afraid because her husband had just been yelling at her and he took the kids and left, and she did not know if they were coming back. Well, the problem with that was that she was not able to even be in group the next week. And you know what all the group members came to the group asking? They were asking whether she was okay. So the group, through the pitfall of self-disclosure, of not having something resolved enough, instead, the group became about her instead of about them. So role modeling is important, but to role model in a way that we keep in self-disclosure in mind, how is this going to impact the group? And to be sure that if it is something that is currently happening, and I'm not saying never use anything that is currently happening. I know some people say that, but for example, Steve and I currently are spending a lot of time with his folks, and his mother suffers from dementia. And one day there was talk about in class some of the challenges, and I was able to say, gosh, I can understand a little bit about what you're talking about, because we have an elderly family member that takes up a lot of our time. And it was very helpful and healing in the conversation. I don't think there was anything I said in that conversation that left the group worried about Dorothy the next day. But rather, it's a mutual thing that we're all struggling with at times. When we lead by example, we want to set the bar, and we want to set it pretty high. If we phone it in, they know it. If we phone it in, what we can expect is that they'll phone it in. The more genuine, the more of a stretch, the more authentic we are, the more we'll get that in return. Even from people who might have a lot of prejudgments about us, it is beautiful how vulnerability can tear apart some of those preconceived judgments about us. And you bet they have them when they come into our room, and they have every reason to have them. In many ways, many in our groups have been treated unfairly, and they walk in there with all of their defenses up. If we set the bar high and we model accountability, those are things they don't expect us to do. They're expecting exactly the opposite of that. It is such a cool thing when they can feel and sense that connection. So the third thing is greasing the wheel, handing it back to them, and really in a genuine way, giving them the permission to go forward with whatever they're struggling with, whatever is keeping them from feeling like they have the permission to share that in the room. I can't talk about self-disclosure and not talk about values and how it fits in. Because for many years, for me, and it sounds like for some of you, the whole idea of self-disclosure gets kind of shut down because we're being told it is unethical or it is against our professional values and ethics. I see it as just the opposite. If we value equity, we want to get rid of the we, they. We want to build a connection amongst the participants with different life experiences. If we value accountability, then we better be modeling it. And then when we model it, we can expect that of participants. And as has been said several times in this conference already, accountability isn't something that we really impose on others like I thought 40 years ago. Accountability can't really be done that way. I mean, if you were to right now think about something that you don't want anybody to ever know about you, what would it take to get you to say those things? If there's one thing, oh, I don't want anybody to know that. Some of us might have more than one thing that we don't want anybody to know. But what would it take? What would we have to have in a group container in order for people to share that thing? You know, a dying declaration. Exactly, Paul. So the bottom line is, if we really don't want anybody to know that, we will lie, we will hedge our bet, we will make something else up, we will whatever. We're not going to go there. So accountability is really about, how do I hold myself accountable? And how do I get them to see that they can hold themselves accountable? And if I expect that of me, then I can expect that of them. The other value that I think is critical here is dignity and respect. I think we get that by leading by example and by normalizing very vulnerable conversations. And then one of my favorites, transformation and hope. Most of those coming, as I mentioned earlier, have restricted emotional expression. Most of them have had horrific things happen to them, one way or another, most early in their childhood. And when we think about how that mapped the rest of the world to danger and how they learned to shut down those adverse feelings and put forward those defense systems that gave them all kinds of unintended consequences. They started drinking to numb out the pain, not intending to get that DUI, not intending to have a whole line of broken relationships and all kinds of work challenges, etc. We might not have gone through some of the experiences that they have gone through, but we can, rather than leading through perfection, we can think about leading through our imperfections. If we're leading through perfection, we're not giving them transformation and hope. we're telling them what to do and that we know best. And anytime we take that approach, we dash their hope because they do not see that they can ever aspire to that. But if we say, yeah, I've screwed up in this way, I've screwed up in that way. Me too. I've been cruel to my loved ones in ways that I wish I wouldn't have been. Me too. Then they can say, God, if Dorothy can do this, maybe I can do this too. So from my point of view, it's a very ethical thing for us to use self-disclosure. Because I think it's a problem to ask people to do things that we are not willing to do. I think it's also important to remember that as powerful as self-disclosure is, it's not, it is a hammer. It is not every tool in the toolbox. And the other tools are in there for a reason too. But when used appropriately, I do believe it enhances connection and is just one of my favorite tools. So with that, I'm just really wanting to turn it to the group and see what's on your mind and what you're thinking about this. And if there are any particular questions coming up for you. And there might be some questions already in the chat that I've missed. You guys have been so patient and engaging. So what are you thinking? More relatable to our clients, yeah. So can I ask you this? In hearing all of that, how could you implement this more in your group? Oh, Sean, thanks. And I think that's true probably for every one of us. We have some unworked stuff. Yeah. There are some great comments here. Paul Bellenboyer, I agree. We should always know why we're using it before we open our mouth and use self-disclosure and plan it out ahead of time. And there have been times when I have used self-disclosure and regretted it, that I was uncomfortable or whatever, and I launched into a story and it wasn't the best fit for what was going on. Yeah, Sean. And what you're saying, I think, Sean, is basically one of the challenges that we have when we come into this work and are so passionate about, we've got to stop the violence. It is so, I think a first step that many have taken. And unfortunately, in many ways, I think is a challenge for us to not get stuck on is the blaming and the correcting and the and using power and control and justifying it because we're using it as a means to the end of stopping the violence. I don't know that that has ever really worked, but for some reason, it seems like we've all gone through phases of believing that for me, this will work. Molly, you want to hear some self-disclosure gone wrong? Oh gosh. So there was a situation where a group member was really struggling with some challenges that they were facing with their family. And those challenges were really quite different than my experience, but for a variety of reasons. I think at the time I was tired, I was overwhelmed, I wasn't thinking clearly, and it was something that was on my mind, and I started talking about it and it didn't land. It wasn't that it did horrible, that it had a horrible impact, but it didn't land. And I took up group space that I shouldn't have taken up. Thanks, Lucas. So Lucas, can everybody see the chat? I turned the group into being about me because I didn't take the time to process after my brother's suicide. I threw myself into my work thinking it would distract me. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Lucas. Thomas, you bring up a good point. It's also hard when clients want information from you that you don't want to share. Yeah. Yeah. So how do people deal with that when clients want information that you don't want to share? In fact, I had that happen to me pretty recently, but first I want to hear what others have to say. It's okay to say no. Yeah. Good opportunity to state your personal boundaries. Yeah. In this last case, I thought he was wanting information from me to make the case that I was so different from him that he could, to kind of get the group that was kind of a fresh group. You know, we'd had a lot of turnover, so there were a lot of new members, and there were a lot that had lived on the streets. Well, I grew up as a little Mennonite girl in rural Moundridge, Kansas area, and that was so far from my existence. And when he asked, I thought that that's kind of where it was going, and I had my guard up, but I took a deep breath and I said, "You're right. I am not. I've never experienced some of those things that you experienced." And just saying that, and just I could just see his eyes soften. And rather than being an aha moment, we were able to talk about how my childhood had brought some of its own obstacles up, and his had, and in some ways there were some similarities. So it ended up being a good thing that I was able to go there, but there are also times when I think it's very appropriate to say no. Yes, the you highfalutin therapy people are not like us, so can't help us. You bet that's exactly what that guy, I thought that's where he was going. And for the life of me, I can't remember the exact question he asked me, but I really felt that my answer might take us down that path, but it took us exactly in the opposite. It took us to commonality instead. And I'm afraid I haven't seen all of the chat. You guys have done a great job of throwing things in here. But I'd like to open it up a little bit more to, are there any last questions? I want to tell you that in FPI, some of you who are in here, I know, have taken some of our training. Self-disclosure is embodied in our work. And we do a training series, 3 different levels. The first one is the art of facilitation. The second one is the affective component. And the third one is mastering the family peace initiative. If you are interested in more about our approach and how we use this, please feel free to get in contact with us. If you have not been using self-disclosure in the past and you're going to try it, if you want to run something by me, please do not hesitate to email me, contact me, and I will be happy to get back in touch with you. This is something that we have a lot of passion about, that using self-disclosure get done in a way that hopefully we don't all have to learn the same hard knocks lessons about it in order to use it effectively. Thank you for your time, everyone, and I'll stay on for the next couple of minutes if you have any questions.